My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. And we are continuing on with this session of the virtual reading group, where we've been doing something different. Whereas usually we just read through a book of Arendt or a book of her essays, we've been looking at a particular topic that and pursuing it through her work. And the topic has been race, prejudice, and racism. And so we started with the Origins of Totalitarianism. We read Introduction into Politics, where we talked a lot about prejudice and her thinking about prejudice a couple of weeks ago. And today we're going to discuss, and with Arendt, this is a bold statement, but maybe her most controversial work. Even more so, I think, than Eichmann in Jerusalem, although Eichmann in Jerusalem has had a wider impact on her reputation, largely because this essay, Reflections on Little Rock, has been ignored even by most of her defenders. Whereas the Eichmann book is widely taught as one of the most assigned and read books of the 20th century, this essay was buried to a certain extent, to a large extent, because even people who think of themselves as friends of Arendt or Arendtians, or whatever term one might use, have largely disavowed this essay, Reflections on Little Rock, and so it's one that I think we have to engage. One of the arguments against her Eichmann book that is typically made today, was recently made again in a new documentary in Israel about the book, is that if she had known what Eichmann really said in Argentina, she would have changed her opinion. And clearly that's not the case, since she largely did know what Eichmann said in Argentina. She talked about it. She read a fair bit of it. And all of the most damning things he said in Argentina, she read. And so what you actually have to do then is think, all right, either Arendt was wrong, or we have to think more deeply about what she said and try and understand it. And I think the same is the case with this essay, Reflections on Little Rock. It's been so widely criticized and condemned and said to be mistaken. And yet you can't dismiss it as something Arendt didn't believe in. The publication history of it is very clear. She wrote it in 1957, occasioned by a picture she saw in the New York Times. There were actually two pictures in the New York Times that day, September 4th, 1957. One was of a 15-year-old Black girl named Elizabeth Eckford, who was being taunted in Little Rock, Arkansas, as she tried to go to school. And the other was a 15-year-old Black girl named Dorothy Counts, who was being harassed not in Little Rock, Arkansas, but in Charlotte, North Carolina. Arendt only mentions one picture. And this has led some people to, criticize her. And in some sense, it's unclear which picture she's actually talking about. In fact, it seems that in some way in her mind, she combines the two photographs and writes about them both. She did make factual errors in her essay. So she mistakenly refers to the man who's accompanying Dorothy Counts in Little Rock as Dr. Edwin Tompkins, a white friend of her family. But Dr. Tompkins is Black. She just didn't see it. And she makes other mistakes as well. In any case, she had written the essay in response to these pictures and in response to what was going on in Little Rock. And she was going to publish it in Commentary magazine, but Commentary in the end refused to publish it. And in fact, I think they wanted to include a disclaimer and responses, and Arendt refused. She then waits 2 years, and after 2 years decides that the essay is still worth publishing. And she then decides to publish it in Dissent magazine. Dissent magazine agrees to publish it, although they do two things. They, one, publish an editorial note where they say that they disagree with it, but because of Arendt's intellectual stature, they publish it because they believe that they believe in freedom of expression, quote, even for views that seem to us entirely mistaken. And they publish two critics of the piece, one by Melvin Tooman and one by David Spitz. So I bring all this up to say that Arendt was widely aware of the controversy that her piece would bring about, was clearly aware of the criticisms of it, and nevertheless thought it important to publish it, which is to say that you can't make the argument here that this was, oh, just something she wrote, or this was unimportant. I think that if you want to understand Hannah Arendt, Reflections on Little Rock goes very much to the heart of her political thinking. And you have to take it seriously. That doesn't mean you have to agree with it or that you have to agree with Hannah Arendt's political thinking. But if her political thinking is powerful, then there's some part of that political thinking which needs to be taken into account and understood to come to the fore in an article like Reflections on Little Rock, which has struck so many people as misguided and wrong. She does so. There's another problem with this text, which I just want to point out, which is that this is one of those Arendt texts, very few Arendt texts that we have, where we don't have an easily accessible version of what the text actually is. So most people today read this text in the book Responsibility and Judgment, which is one of the early posthumous collections collected and edited by Jerome Cohen. Jerry, for a whole host of reasons, chose to do two things. One, he chose to leave out the long preliminary remarks that Arendt appended to the beginning of the essay when she republished it in Dissent. And two, he chose to replace them with an excerpt, a long excerpt, from her reply to critics that she wrote in the next issue of Dissent in the spring 1959 issue. So if you're reading the text in Responsibility and Judgment, it starts with an introduction, which is not actually from the text, but is from the reply to critics. And it goes for 4 pages. If you're reading the text in Dissent magazine or online, you don't actually get that introduction at all, unless you look at the next issue of Dissent magazine. But instead, you get a preliminary remarks. So I just point this out, that this is, when I said that, this is a text that in many ways Arendt scholars and friends have run away from, it's not even clear, we don't even have a reliable edition of it yet published. I'm hoping to remedy that soon, but that's the case we're at now. In the preliminary remarks, Arendt justifies her decision to publish this, what she calls topical article 2 years out of date, by writing this. She says, recent developments have convinced me that such hopes are futile, namely that the problem she'd hoped to encounter would go away, that such hopes are futile, and that the routine repetition of liberal cliches may be even more dangerous than I thought a year ago. I therefore agreed to let Dissent publish the article as it was written, not because I thought that a year-old topical essay could possibly exhaust the subject or even do justice to the many difficult problems involved, but in the hope that an even inadequate attempt might help to break the dangerous routine in which the discussion of these issues is being held from both sides. So, again, she says more in this preliminary remarks, but we'll leave it at that. She also says that she thinks marriage laws were more dangerous than school segregation laws. She admits that her essay ignores the importance that the role that education plays in the United States as a melting pot, something that she did write about in another essay in between when she wrote the first draft of this essay and then published it, called Crisis in Education. And she says, I would have added that material to this essay, but I've already written it in another essay, so I'm not going to, but look there. And she says she takes it for granted that people understand that she writes this as an outsider and a Jew, and that takes her sympathy with all Blacks, Negroes is what she writes, and all oppressed people as a matter of course. So what are the dangerous liberal cliches? By the way, let me just stop right there. I'm gonna give an introduction as I always do, but I've also asked my colleague and the program director of the Hannah Arendt Center, Jana Schmidt, to reflect on this essay. She's written a lot about these questions, and so I'll say some things, and then she'll jump in and follow up, and then we'll have our conversation. So you get the benefit of two different takes on this essay at the beginning. So what are the dangerous liberal cliches that Arendt is worried about? She says in the essay that the point at stake is not the well-being of the Negro population alone. And I'm just going to use the word she wrote at the time. I hope that's okay. But at least, she says, in the long run, the real point at stake is the survival of the Republic. Why is she worried about the survival of the Republic around these questions? It's because what she calls increasing equality, right? As there's increasing equality around marriage and schools and economic equality and social equality, sometimes that leads to fading away of prejudices. But as we discussed in the last meeting we had 2 weeks ago when we read Introduction into Politics, it's often the case that when prejudices crumble with rising equality, the result is not more equality, but actually a reaffirmation of the prejudicial views, but no longer simply as opinions or prejudices, but now as ideologies, as racisms. And she's worried that as the civil rights movement enjoys certain success and prejudices begin to crumble and Blacks in the United States become more equal in some ways, she's worried about a kind of racist resurgence, a counter movement where ideological racism reemerges in different ways. And given this, she says, we need to take care that government intervention be guided by caution and moderation. She says federal government intervention should be limited to those instances in which the law of the land and the principle of the republic are at stake. And this is sort of the guiding premise here, is that we have to be principled in her mind. And the fundamental principle that governs her approach here is she puts it in different ways, but one way near the beginning of the essay is she writes, for the crucial point to remember is that it is not the social custom of segregation that is unconstitutional, but its legal enforcement, right? The crucial point to remember is that it is not the social custom of segregation that is unconstitutional, but its legal enforcement. What drove Arendt to write Reflections on Little Rock was her fear that the confusion of racism, which is a political enforcement of segregation and discrimination, her confusion of racism and prejudice, which is a social prejudgment and opinion would lead integrationist liberals who were so confident in the justice of their prejudices for integration to impose their prejudices on others, just as earlier white supremacists had imposed their prejudice for segregation. So the point here is that, and this, remember, we have to talk to, as we talked about 2 weeks ago, for Arendt, prejudice is simply a natural part of human life. We're all prejudiced. And in politics, all prejudices are simply opinions. And the question is, which opinions are valid, which opinions are valid, legitimate political opinions, and which are not. And for her, racism, the legal enforcement of segregation or discrimination, is an invalid prejudice. It's an invalid opinion. But prejudice, simply a feeling of difference, or that I want to hang out with my friends who are Jews, or my friends who are Muslims, or my friends who are chess players, or my friends who are white wasps, or my friends who are blacks. She says that's a legitimate prejudice. She does believe that it's legitimate for people to want a vacation in a resort just with Jews, or just with Muslims, or just with whites, or just with blacks. And she says, again, that the question is not how to abolish discrimination, but how to keep it confined within the social sphere where it is legitimate and prevent its trespassing on the political and personal sphere where it's destructive. That's on page 206. So this is part of Arendt's distinction between what she calls three human realms: the public realm, the social realm, and the private realm. And this is something that's, again, deeply part of her thinking. She writes about it in The Human Condition. She writes about it in many of her books. It's in her writing about it in this book that it's caused, or in this essay, that it's caused so much controversy. But just to remind us, by the public realm, she means the public realm of laws and politics. And in that public realm, the basic principle is equality. Everyone must be treated equally. And segregation, as discrimination enforced by law, right, is illegal and is unconstitutional and is inconsistent with the public realm. But desegregation, she says, can do no more than abolish the laws enforcing discrimination. It cannot abolish discrimination itself. And this is, I think, a point that is often overlooked, but it's important. Arendt is arguing against segregation, but she's not arguing in favor, or she's arguing against also forced desegregation. She's saying that in politics, you have to treat people equally, but if people still in society want to segregate themselves, they can. The social realm, right, which is society, is actually a realm in which the basic principle is not equality, but discrimination. She says what equality is to the body politic, its innermost principle, discrimination is to society. And the society is one of these terms in Arendt that's, sometimes hard to pin down, but here it's pretty clear. She calls it where we spend most of our lives, when we're in college or school, or at our vacation resorts, or at our job, where we earn a living. And in society, the principle is like attracts like, discrimination. People belong to groups. They hang out with people they want to hang out with. That means they don't hang out with people they don't want to hang out with. They have to discriminate. There is no society without discrimination. And so she says the question is not how to abolish discrimination, but how to keep it confined within the social sphere where it is legitimate and prevent its trespassing on the political and personal sphere where it is destructive. And she then gives two examples, one where she thinks discrimination is legitimate and one where it's illegitimate. She says it's perfectly legitimate for Jews to vacation in the Catskills and only have Jews at the resorts. To have Jewish resorts or Muslim resorts or black resorts or white resorts she thinks is a perfectly legitimate form of discrimination. Why can't people decide to vacation where they want to vacation and with whom? She says, however, it's completely illegitimate to discriminate in buses, hotels, or business districts or movie theaters, because then you don't come together to be with people like yourselves. You come together to be part of a town or a community or an artistic community. And even though these things like theaters and buses and hotels are not strictly political, they are in the public domain where all men are equal. And she says discrimination in Southern railroads and buses is as scandalous as discrimination in hotels and restaurants throughout the country. And so she makes this distinction between social realms, social institutions, which are outside of the public, things like resorts, and things like bars and restaurants and hotels and buses and trains, which are part of the public and have to treat everyone equally. If you think to the case that had been in the Supreme Court in the last few years around a Christian baker, who allowed everyone into his bakery and sold everyone, whether they were gay or straight, cakes and muffins, but had a private business on the side where he only did wedding cakes for Christian couples and wouldn't do gay couples. Arendt would say, I think, again, that's fine. As long as you treat everyone equally in your store as a public entity, great. But if you're a gay baker and you want to only bake cakes for gay weddings, you should be able to do that on a non-public level, at a social level. The third realm is the private realm, which is not a realm defined by equality as the public sphere or even discrimination as the social sphere, but she says by exclusiveness. In the human condition, she uses the word uniqueness. And it's here we choose who we spend the rest of our lives with, our friends, our lovers. And in choosing it, we don't base it on their social identity, what color they are or what sexuality they have, but they're one person, their uniqueness. And here's where Arendt really draws the power, I think, of her essay, which is to say that for her, choosing who you marry, who your friends are, is one of the fundamental rights of being a human. And so she says, I should be able to marry whoever I want. You remember, Arendt was a Jew who married, her second marriage at least was with a non-Jew, so it was a mixed marriage. So this was very personal to her. And what she said is, no one should tell me that I can't marry someone who's not Jewish, just like no one should tell a white woman that she can't marry a black man, or a black man that can't marry a white woman, or a gay man that they can't marry another gay man. No one should be able to tell me that. That's a human right. But she says it would be crazy and it would be a violation of rights if we told everyone you have to marry someone of the opposite sex, or you have to marry someone of the same sex, or you have to marry someone of the opposite race. She's like, again, it's the laws against mixed marriages that are unconstitutional, not the social practice. And in the same way, she says, it's the laws against integrated education that are offensive, not the social practice. And so there's a danger that she finds in legally enforced prejudices, whether it's the legally enforced prejudices of white supremacists or the legally enforced prejudices of liberal integrationists. And she writes, while the government has no right to interfere with the prejudices and discriminatory practices of society, it has not only the right, but the duty to make sure that these practices are not legally enforced. What liberals fail to understand, she says, near the end of the essay, is that the true nature of power is such that the power potential of the Union, of the United States, as a whole will suffer if regional foundations on which this power rests are undermined. The point is, if the federal government comes in and takes away local power, this is something we're going to talk about next week when I read the essay on violence. We will, in a sense, destroy power. And as you know, power is what Arendt thinks is the progenitor of action and thus politics. In the end, her argument in the favor of, in favor of the courts calling segregation laws unconstitutional, but opposing the enforced desegregation of schools, really rests on the argument around the private and the social realm. Her basic argument is that children are part of the family and home, to be brought up in, quote, the idiosyncratic exclusiveness which alone makes a home strong and secure enough to shield its young against the demands of social responsibilities. And it's a basic right of parents to bring up their children as they see fit, which she calls a right to privacy that has existed throughout history. To force parents to send their children to an integrated school, she writes, against their will means to deprive them of the rights which clearly belong to them in all free societies, the private rights over their children and the right to free association. So that's the argument, as I take it, that she's making in this essay. It's very much rooted deeply in her belief in plurality, and the fact that that society has to exist with a plurality of opinions, including opinions we don't like, and that we have to learn to live in a society with different meaningful opinions, different prejudices, different, in some cases, things we really disagree with. The important thing is to not legalize those prejudices, to not turn them into pseudo-theories and ideologies, but to constantly engage them and seek to dispel them, but not to federally or legally enforce them. So that's I take it to be, in my reading, the argument of the essay and why I think it's central to her work and can't be separated from her work. There are certainly things one can say she's simply mistaken about, and distance from it, and we'll get into those. But I wanted to let Jana first talk a little bit about some other aspects of the work, including her attempt to think from the perspective of Black families through imagination. So Jana, you're up.
Hi. Yeah, so when I was looking at this essay again, I was struck by, so in this introductory beginning that was added, she raises three questions, or she proceeds by way of three questions. And we could describe these three questions, which I don't think are accidentally a response to critics, as a form of enlarged mentality. So this practice of putting yourself in the position of someone else. And the first question that she asks is, what would I do if I were a Negro mother? The second is, what would I do if I were a white mother in the South? And then the third one relates to what exactly distinguishes the so-called Southern way of life from the American way of life with respect to the color question. And I asked myself, why, what is the point of these three questions? She's taking on the position of these three kind of identities, not in the service of a moral argument, as we might expect, or even a very emotional argument, right? But she does identify pride or personal integrity as a kind of supreme value or deciding factor. And I think that despite her sort of little bit weird misidentification of the image of Elizabeth Eckford, we can see that pride is, in fact, a relevant category in these pictures, right? So if you look at that famous picture, or the whole series of pictures, Elizabeth Eckford appears as an intensely prideful person. Her posture, the way that she's wearing these dark glasses, she looks very cool. She has her book sort of poised, and she doesn't seem fazed at all by the mob and the reporters. So she doesn't, contrary to what Arendt's fear is she doesn't actually appear to me, when I look at that image as a social climber, she appears as someone with immense personal integrity. So if you go to page 203, I think the passage on 203 gets to the heart of what Arendt is concerned with here in the essay. The final sentence on 203, the picture looks to me like a fantastic caricature of progressive education, which, by abolishing the authority of adults, implicitly denies their responsibility for the world into which they have born their children and refuses the duty of guiding them into it. Now, why is authority and education and responsibility for the world such a key issue? I think it's really kind of like, when you let that sink in, it's really kind of stunning, because in a way, this essay about race isn't about race at all. It is about this question of the common world and of responsibility towards the world. What Arendt fears most in desegregation is that, or in forced desegregation, is that it absconds with that responsibility towards the world that we as adults have towards children. And she fears that pushing children into the world prematurely destroys the very possibility of a common world for them, sort of like prematurely takes it away, so to speak. Now, I think from our modern perspective, after decades of very different discussions around race, I think that must strike us as odd, right? I think that most of our response, and correct me if I'm wrong on that, but we would think that responsibility for the world means exactly what Eckford is doing, right? She's taking responsibility for not only for her own fate, but also for the sort of situation of the United States. And this is what Ellison points out in his letter, which we will get to next week. So Arendt fears that, so despite this sort of modern response that we might have, I think there is something valid to her analysis at the time, and that is, she fears that we can't solve the question of equality on social grounds, and that we cannot fundamentally let people who belong as yet to the private realm we can't task them with this problem of equality. The question that I had for Arendt, and that continues to bug me, I think it's a really, really difficult essay, is can a racist world be a common world, right? Sort of like very shortly and simply put. And I think that insofar as equality before the law and in politics is concerned, she would say no. A legally racist world cannot be a common world. But in the social realm, which, as Roger pointed out, cannot be legislated, equality is not a meaningful category. So if you want to have a look at page 208 and 209, I think these passages are really interesting, where she talks about the realm of the private, right? At the top of 208, the rules of uniqueness and exclusiveness are and always will be in conflict with the standards of society, precisely because social discrimination violates the principle and lacks validity for the conduct of private life. So what she's pointing to here, and then on the next page, 209, also at the beginning or in the middle of the first paragraph, the government can legitimately take no steps against social discrimination because government can act only in the name of equality, a principle which does not obtain in the social sphere. So I think we are led astray if we try to solve the essay, or we try to address the essay by deciding exactly what the social realm, where it ends and where the private begins and where the political, the point is not to get these realms clear and differentiate them once and for all, but to recognize their intertwinement and to recognize that the tension between them is what's important. The goal for Arendt isn't, and this is counterintuitive to our modern thinking about race, a kind of harmony of spheres, right? We imagine sort of like, oh, everyone's in harmony, right? Like in the social, no one's racist. In the political, no one's racist. All the spheres are sort of the same, right? But for her, it's precisely the tension that ensures diversity and difference. So in order to have a common world, to be responsible for the world for her does not mean being responsible for a world as we like it, right? Like, of course, we would like to abolish racism. But it also does not mean quite a world as it is, right? She's not, I don't think she's a kind of pragmatist who's sort of like, we have to take it as it is and be responsible for it. But the world as the possibility, or differently put, the possibility of a world that includes all possible differences. Yeah. So that's what I take away from this essay, and I think that is worth holding on to. All right. Should we open for questions and comments?
Thanks so much, Jana. I really appreciate that. And I think it's great to have, a lot of voices here. So a couple just reminders. There's two ways you can participate in case there's anyone joining us new. One is through the chat. Please be respectful. Remember, you're welcome to have strong opinions, but make it against ideas and the text and not against individuals. And two, you can raise your hand through going down to the reactions button and click raise hands and join the queue. And we'll have a discussion. So, Bob, you're up first. I know you love this essay.
Thank you, Roger. Putting aside the appropriateness of the categorization of public education as belonging to the social world or the political world, in reading this, I was wondering about the Civil War of the 19th century and wondering if Arendt ever mused about that, because on the one hand, it certainly threatened the unity of the Republic, but on the other hand, it was maybe the ultimate expression of federalism. And the war, cost so many lives and did something, but not much for African Americans who then faced Jim Crow for 75 years or more into the present. And so I'm just wondering about that. My own personal opinion, I think it would have been better had we let the South go, because they've held us back for all this period of time.
I don't recall her ever, opining on whether we should have let the South go or not. She does opine on things like, and which she says here and says elsewhere as well, that slavery was the great sin of the American Republic. And she says that while the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were important, we needed another amendment, an amendment that fully took responsibility for and explicitly made former slaves and Blacks full citizens of the American Republic. And so she says that at the end of her essays on civil disobedience. I don't know if Jana, you want to add anything on the Civil War or that? Okay.
No.
I mean, so Bob, I mean, I don't know about, whether she would have been a fan of fighting the Civil War to keep the country intact. I don't know. She certainly does believe in the importance of local power. And to that extent, she does believe constitutionally in the importance of federalism, as you rightly pointed out, which she makes the case in the book on revolution, amongst many other places. And so whether it would have been good to jettison the South, I don't know. I don't think I never heard her give an opinion on it. And I don't think she would have agreed with it. And here's why I say why. Is, as she says in this essay, and as she also says in a letter we're going to read in 2 weeks to Robert Hutchins at the University of Chicago, she actually thinks in many ways racism can be more of a problem today in the North than in the South. And she says that here as well, that it may be that that it turns out that there's more blatant racism today in the North than there is in the South. And it's something she worried about, but I'm not sure. That's all I can say on that question. James.
Roger, I loved where this essay took me. Is this the essay we're supposed to be reading, Reflections on Little Rock?
Yes.
Years ago, when I was working as an ambassador for UNICEF, I was working in Ghana, Cameroon, and South Africa, and I encountered certain issues that I never resolved until I was given the space in this essay through this discussion of private, social, and political to re-examine those issues. One was, I was talking to a group of students up in Marwa, which is right at the edge of the sub-Saharan desert. These kids were asking me, why does UNICEF care more about girls than they care about boys? It blew my mind. I didn't realize there was such a strong energy that UNICEF was creating by supporting girls and women in these communities. It just blew my mind. The other issue that I was exploring at that point was the whole history of clitorectomy and its relationship to the support of women's position as the main property owners in the culture and how that worked and didn't work. Her discussion of private, social, political, and as Jana said, the not destroying the common world just really stirred up a lot of space for me to consider these issues that I've always had. Well, it's got to be this way. No. Take it back, look at it again, open up that space. And I just wanted to share that.
I appreciate it, James. I mean, this is the complicated thing, is that we read this essay, many of us as liberals, and I don't mean everyone on the call is a liberal at all, but many identify as liberal. And, it has become a kind of unquestionable and probably not wrong shibboleth, at least in the United States, for the importance of integrated education, right? Yeah. And by the way, Arendt in her preliminary remarks says, this may be one of the mistakes I made. And she says, I addressed it in another essay, Crisis in Education, where in that essay, she says the United States is a special case because our schools are not just about educating people, but they're also about creating a common world. And that in some ways, the schools in the United States are a melting pot. It's where students learn to become, not white or women or boys or men or Jews or Muslims, but to become Americans. And she says, that's not a traditional function of education, but in the United States it is. And I didn't take that into account in this essay. And so in that essay, she does take it into account and she talks more about it. And I think that's one of the complicating factors, for someone reading her essay today, because she just doesn't address that aspect of it. But on the other side, right, what she's saying is part of also being in the United States is understanding that there are people from fundamentally different worldviews. There's Mormons, there's Jews, there's Seventh-day Adventists, there's MAGA Republicans, there's anarchists, there's all sorts. And all of them are legitimately part of the United States community, so long as they respect the public world and other American requirements. And so part of her view is that what makes America great is that you can live there as a Jew, as an Orthodox Jew, or as a Mormon, or as a Muslim, or in your private life as a racist. That's just part of being an American. Those are prejudices, as long as they're just prejudicial racisms. But once they become ideological, which means that they have to be enforced legally and politically, then they're un-American. Then they threaten the republic. And I think the hard part, there's different levels, right? One level is simply understanding her argument. Another, understanding if it's right or not. I think it's very clear to me that she's right about something deep, that it's important to respect prejudices and to respect that our prejudice, my prejudice for an integrated education, that I want to be in school with as a Jew, with Muslims and blacks and foreign students and all sorts, is a prejudice. And there are many respectful, thoughtful Jews and Muslims who only want to go to schools with other Jews or other Muslims. And that's totally fine for her. She thinks maybe we should try and convince them to be like us, and they should try and convince us to be like them. And in some sense, we have to come to some sort of political compromise. That's what democracy and Republican democracy is for her. But you can't force it on people. And I think once we start to complicate this by not just seeing it as, in the history of segregated schools and racism in this country, and see it more generally as all the different prejudices and social prejudices and private prejudices we have, it gets much more complicated the way you just did, James. But then we have to come back to the question, all right, we have this actual American problem of 200 years of segregated schools and segregated life and racism, and how are we going to make good on that? And that's the challenge, right? And her argument is, yeah, there's a lot of incentive to just go in and say, segregation is bad, let's get rid of all segregation. And she's like, well, that's tempting. It's going to lead to a backlash. It could lead to a backlash. And it's also against the principles of the country. And that's the challenge that she's making. And it's deep rooted in her thought. And that's why I don't think you can ignore this article if you're interested in the provocation of her thought.
No, I loved it.
Just one note. I don't usually get to read the chat much, but because when Jana was talking, I took a quick look. Joyce Mullen said something that I thought was very important to at least to bring up and respond to, which is that she said, having taught MLK's letter from the Birmingham jail, I couldn't help thinking that Arendt sounded like a white moderate. And I just say, I think that's not right. I mean, a white moderate, as MLK understood it, is someone who's not going to rock the boat on the laws around bus boycotts and riding the bus and getting rid of the laws allowing for Jim Crow. Arendt was adamant that we get rid of Jim Crow. She was adamant that all laws legally enforcing segregation were unconstitutional, against the Republic, and had to be undone. That's not what MLK meant by a white moderate, I don't think. She simply had a different level, which is to say, once you get rid of the laws, we then have to have a different conversation about where is segregation allowed socially. And she would then say on buses, no, because they're part of the public, right? That's in the essay. And in hotels, no. But in resorts out in the country where just people of Jews want to go or just Muslims want to go, okay. So I just think it's an important distinction to make. Peter.
Hi. Well, I was going to talk about public school being not a free school, but a place where a public is formed. But I'm going to switch since you brought up the letter from a Birmingham jail, or the person in the chat, I forget the name, I'm sorry.
Joyce.
Brought it up that it's somewhat a charge possible. And I think especially I want to bring it up because it resonates given one of the earlier pieces you mentioned, that I thought letter from a Birmingham jail is actually chiding his colleagues, his allies, the clergy who after the bombing preach moderation. They're going to be there and he's going to leave and they're going to suffer the consequences. And it's basically an attack against them, or a loving attack against them for daring to promote moderation. And I find that also at a basic level, and you read from it, I think, in fact, you mentioned the part where she suggests that you advocate the government intervention be guided by caution and moderation rather than by impatience. I won't get into ill-advised measures because that's definitional, but certainly it's the idea that you go slowly. And so not only does King say this, there's a relatively famous moment when Thurgood Marshall, then at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, is there helping Arthurine Lucy be the first Black woman in University of Alabama. And outside in the streets, there's white folks committing violence and rioting. And reporters question Marshall. He says, sir, you know that all this violence is happening outside. Do you or don't you believe in gradualism? And he relatively famously says, oh, in fact, I do believe in gradualism. I believe the Emancipation Proclamation was signed in 1865. That's 90 years ago. I think that's pretty gradual. And so part of this just feels like the thing that well-situated people do often suggest, be moderate, because they're still being provided for by the current ways of the society benefiting them or privileging them. I have a friend who has some mental illness and she has a good ability to define problems, but has a problem with every single solution. I do think on the issue of race, this country suffers from the same mental illness.
I appreciate it. Yeah, I mean, all I'll say about this is, and I'll let Yana if she wants to jump in. When Arendt says moderation, she doesn't mean what the white clergy was saying, which is do nothing and just let it go slowly around racist laws and Jim Crow and segregation. What she's saying is take a principled stand on the principle of legal segregation, but don't try and solve the entire problem of racism in society, because that can't be solved, or prejudice in society. And that's what I think she means. Yana, do you want to add anything?
I mean, I think it gets tricky around this question of the sort of the tradition of the South, right? There's a sort of assumption in this essay that racism is part of the culture of the South, and that therefore, you can't force people into equality abruptly, right? And, I mean, that has to do with her definition of the social sphere and of the private realm. But as many people in the chat have pointed out, obviously this in the South very much spills over into the political, right? So where if you discriminate in the social realm by, on every single scale imaginable, then you end up with Black people who don't dare to speak up, who don't dare to vote, who don't, who feel thoroughly intimidated, right? So you can't. There is a way in which the social ground has to be, it has to be sort of equal enough in order to enable people to embody equality in the political, right? And that is really tricky. Yeah.
I think that's really important. You know, I mean, you have to have a certain amount of, you have to have a certain basic equality in the material world of society so that people can actually engage in politics. And Arendt certainly believes that, but she doesn't write as much about it as some people would like. And so I think that's an important corrective. Susan.
So one of my issues here is this somehow assumption that the public schools are not in the public realm, and her assertion of parents having the right to make decisions for their children, which I don't know about the laws in Europe, but in the United States, coming over on the Mayflower from 1601 was this little doctrine called parens patriae, which actually, it means the state is the father, and it gives the state the right to decide anything they want about your children. It was one of the bases for the formation of the public schools in this country, and it continues to this day, which is why when there's a custody battle, you have to go to court, the court gets to decide. So I think she's mistaken about this right that she assumes, and there's been a couple hundred years of legal battles in this country for parents to have the right to make decisions for their children, but it is definitely not a slam dunk here. So I think she's wrong about that, and I think she's wrong about the idea that the public schools are not public. If you only want to go to school with people like yourself, then you go to a private school, and that's exactly what they did during massive resistance. In Virginia, for example, they created endless numbers of private schools, in addition to closing some of the public schools.
Yeah, so, you know, let's, so in the United States, the government has very little say about how you educate your children, right? I mean, they can tell you that you have to educate your children up to 16. And that's really, in most states, that's about all we have. There's all sorts of, I mean, public schools actually emerged fairly late, I think, in this country. You know, I think one of the things I mentioned earlier that Arendt talks about is that she ignores in this the sort of way in which public schools help create a melting pot, or whatever you want to call it, a mosaic, and help people become American. But yeah, I mean, the idea of parental control over schools is deeply ingrained in this country. I mean, PTAs, parent involvement. I mean, it's one of the main issues going on around the country right now, in opposition on both sides. On the one hand, trying to impose more, you know, DEI and diversity training, and on the other hand, resisting it, and around issues of trans issues and gay issues, but also on race issues. So I think there's a very strong tradition of local parental control of school and school boards and curriculum in this country. So I'm not sure why you think otherwise, but maybe that's a different conversation. She says on page 211, near the bottom, she says the possibility of private education provides no way out of the dilemma, because it would make the safeguarding of certain private rights dependent upon economic status, right? So if you just let people opt out of public schools and have segregated private schools, it doesn't help, because there'll be poor white or poor black or poor Jewish or poor Muslim or whatever families who are unable to get what they want. And then she says parents' rights over their children are legally restricted by compulsory education and nothing else, right? And I think that's an accurate description of the United States, at least in my understanding. I don't know, Susan, is that right?
You're muted.
I don't actually agree with that, but like you say, that's a longer conversation. I think there's a long tradition of the government dictating on many levels, and I don't think PTOs have power. I would agree that what we're seeing now are parents exercising more power than probably they have ever. But PTOs, I think, were, they were to bake the cakes and whatever. I don't think they had any power. And I think in terms of custody and things like that, and the basis for children in school is something called in loco parentis, which is very similar to parens patriae. It means the minute you walk into the building, you have no rights as a child. The school has the right to determine whatever they want. So I don't agree, but I think it is a long conversation. Thank you.
Okay, George.
I'll be brief. I think that it's intellectually, it's easy to say that social should not be the same as political, but when it comes to power and practical power, again, just look at education, is that the power, if it were, let's say, separate but equal, which was the slogan at that time, if it actually could be that, then I think she has an argument. But unless you have the same economic power, the education cannot be separate but equal, because you have real estate taxes paying for good education, et cetera, et cetera. So that's number one. Number two, so I don't see how she could go that without having the separate but equal, but equal economically. This is
just to be clear, George, just want to be clear, she's not arguing for separate but equal, right?
No, but what I'm saying, if there was such a thing as separate and equal, then but whatever is separate now, from a practical standpoint, becomes unequal.
Well, so, you're maybe right, but if you want to talk about it in pure economic and power terms, I would say that would probably disadvantage white students more than Black students, right? My guess is that, most of the more well-off white students would actually choose integrated schools, and be in schools with Black students, whereas it would probably be a lot of the poorer white students, who would choose the segregated schools. At least, I don't know for sure, but that's my assumption. So I don't think it's as obvious or clear. What she's saying is give people a choice. They're all public schools. They all have to be equally funded as public schools. And she's not saying don't argue for and encourage and provide integrated schools. She's saying do that, but saying that if some people don't want it, let them send their kids to all white schools, and they'll probably be poorer schools in all likelihood.
Right, so long as they're not tax supported.
Well, they're all tax supported, but in the same way. But my guess is they're in poorer areas, and you know how it works. Poorer areas get less support than richer areas.
Yeah. Now, the second thing I think was just more important. Briefly, I think she was right in what happens when you make the social political, because now we have identity politics, and what you have is you've got groups that claim to be superior, white superiority, and things like that are political groups now, whereas before, hopefully, at least it looked like it was more social, and now it's in a political era that all these things are being played out, and it's much more difficult and it's much more dangerous.
Thank you. I see we got a lot of questions, so I'm going to try and move ahead. Stephen.
Thank you, Roger. You introduced this discussion by saying the essay is an example of Arendt's political thinking. But what strikes me is the extent to which he evades the political dimension of the conflict over school integration in the South. For one thing, she refers to Governor Faubus, his extraordinary misbehavior. Well, this is not behavior. If anyone's a political actor in this story, it's Governor Faubus. She ignores the Supreme Court ruling. Warren Burger explicitly talked about equality under the law in access to public schools. She does not take into account the fact that the NAACP had very deliberately trained these children and chosen these children to be effective in withstanding the racism they would encounter. She seems to minimize the political dimension at every step in this essay. So, and it also seems to me that what is sort of overwhelming is, you know, where does this begin? It begins with a reaction to actually two photographs that she melds into one. And this is a girl who, as she sees it, is facing a mob. She sort of erases the all that is behind this girl, both the parents, which she didn't know about, the NAACP. She sees a girl who's facing a mob, who's facing racist invective. And I can't help but think that she's really thinking about herself as a child in a racist society. And when she looks at the Black mother and at the white mother, I think, well, the Black mother who should be preserving her child's dignity rather than social climbing. I think this is about the parvenu, Jew, and her whole feeling about Jews who want to assimilate. I really think that she's imposing on the situation in the southern United States, memories and feelings about what it means to be a Jew in Germany.
Jana, do you want to take that up or not?
No, I mean, all I can say is that I think you're right. I think that there is a transposition happening, but I'm not sure that this is that it invalidates her entire essay, right? Or that it makes it less interesting, right? It's obviously maybe not, like I was saying, it's sort of, you were saying it sort of ignores the political, and I would say it actually sort of in a strange way evades the question of racism, right? So both of those things are going on, but for what she does address, it may still be an interesting thing to look at.
Right, I'm not saying it invalidates the essay at all, but it adds a dimension to the essay. It's really, the emphasis seems to be more on the private sphere than on the political sphere.
Yeah,
I think you're absolutely right. Look, there are many ways she could have made this a political essay, right? She could have talked about, as you said, the training of Elizabeth Eckford and the way that this was an act of civil disobedience. And this is where Ralph Ellison criticizes her, right? And we'll talk about that, I think, in 2 weeks, because but it's an important critique. But and we could say, oh, she should have written that. You have to remember, this was a short topical piece, and it wasn't about that. And we could say, oh, well, that's what it should have been about, but it's not what it's about, right? What was it about? It was about the mob. I think your invocation of the mob is right. She looked at this mob, this white mob, and said, holy cow, this looks like the Nazis to me. I mean, that's how I don't know if Jana sees it that way, but and I think she saw it, it's not just that. She then put it in her analysis and said, this is a mob, and they are standing up now for actually, though, what are rights? And the rights are private rights. How do we educate our kids? And to the extent we, as good liberals, like liberal cliches, she says, are enforcing our integrationist prejudices on them, we're actually helping to form a mob. and we're helping to form a mob that it's not that it's justified. I don't think that's at all, but that it's going to be understandable. And it's going to be caused by an overreach, a governmental overreach, a liberal governmental overreach. And I think that's what she's saying.
Right. And she was afraid that the reaction would move the Southern families who were having this integration forced upon them. It would take them from race thinking to a racist ideology. So exactly. I think she was fearing that what would happen as a result of this is that the United States would move closer to the kind of racism that she encountered in Europe.
I think that's exactly what's going on. I happen to agree with you. Stephen.
Thank you. I often have thought critical thoughts of Arendt because I think she thinks from too an abstract or high an ideal. So I think this was really an interesting essay for me. And I think that she intuited some characteristics that this group may not appreciate. Because I think, Roger, you were right when you said we're all liberals. I think we are, in the sense that I suspect most people here have a liberal arts education and are very open to experience, open to other cultures, other religions, other races, other nationalities, and that most people in the United States and around the world are much less open to new experiences.
Yeah.
And that this in your comments where you talked about like groups wanting to vacation or be around their fellow group members, whether it's religious or cultural, professional. I assume academics like academics. God help me, I'm a lawyer. I like lawyers, you know, we all have our preferences. So I think she intuits that. And that's something I think important to think about, because what Stephen Most just said, and I think you agreed, is what we saw as a result of this great movement, which I think everybody agrees, you know, had a extreme moral imperative to it, was an immense backlash. And we're still seeing types of backlashes even today. And, you know, that may be just the price we have to pay, but I think she had some good intuitions in that regard in this essay, and how the mass of people, the majority of people, would respond to the compulsions of integration.
Thank you. I'll take that as a comment and appreciate it. Because I agree. Alex.
Yeah, I'm just kind of curious to try to get back into the late 50s, early 60s kind of mode of thinking. It's interesting that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was not based on the Reconstruction era amendments like the 14th Amendment or the 15th Amendment, but was based on the Interstate Commerce Clause. So part of the argument that civil rights liberals had to make was that hotels and restaurants and boarding houses and stuff in the South were engaged in interstate commerce, which would put them kind of into the public sphere, as opposed to the segregationist Southerners and the Goldwaterites who argued that they were private property and therefore were private and social and not in any kind of exposed to public constitutional standards. So I was kind of curious what you thought of how she was trying to deal with that evolving argument early on in its existence that eventually led to the successful passage of the Civil Rights Act. Thank you.
Yeah, Alex, I mean, I think that, part of this is just unfortunate, weird things about American constitutional law, right? Which is that,
yes,
for the 14th Amendment to be was the 14th Amendment was a part of the federal Constitution. And if you have a state law that that violates the 14th Amendment, the 14th Amendment doesn't necessarily apply to it because the amendments apply to the federal government and laws the federal government make, not the states governments make. The way the court...
Not quite, Roger, because federal law has supremacy. And in fact,
federal law, but the point is the federal Constitution, in order for a state law to come under federal law, you had to, in a sense, apply the Bill of Rights or the 14th Amendment to the states. And the way it was done was through through things like the Interstate Commerce Clause, to say that these actually were not just state laws, but they actually encountered across the country, right? I mean, you had to nationalize the Bill of Rights, and the 14th Amendment was one way we did that, right? I mean,
well, I think the point here was that the civil rights advocates wanted to be on safe ground using the Interstate Commerce Clause. In fact, the Bill of Rights has been applied to states as well. But I think
only some of them, not all of them, and they have to be incorporated, and they're incorporated through the 14th Amendment. And the Interstate Commerce Clause was one way that happened. I'm going back to my law school training, but it's a little while.
Almost, but the only point I was trying to make was that the idea of a public sphere involving hotels and restaurants was a key part of the argument that the liberals had to make, and her arguments seemed to buttress their position very well. And to put it in the time of the late 50s, early 60s, I think liberals were interested in political theorists making that argument.
Yeah. No, okay. I mean, she wants to argue that even private businesses that operate in public spaces should be treated as part of the public sphere.
Yes.
And I think that's an important argument. And I think it's an argument that's right and has won. The interesting part of it is her other side of the argument, where she says, well, private businesses that operate not really in the public sphere, like vacation resorts or custom bakers. And there you can see a real tension in the liberals today, because the liberals want, a lot of liberals have argued that a Christian baker has to bake a cake for anyone who comes in. But I think Arendt would I have no idea, but my reading of her texts is such that it leads to the claim that no, if you have a private private business where you bake cakes, whether you're a Muslim who only wants to bake for Muslims, or a Jew who only wants to bake for Jews, or a Christian who only wants to bake for Christians, I think Arendt would say that's fine.
I don't. I think they're in the same.
Based on the logic of her argument, I'm just telling you reading her argument.
Well, if they sell the cakes in public, like a hotel offers a room to the public.
Absolutely. If you sell it in public, everyone has to come in. So that's where she makes the distinction. If you have a bakery, everyone has to come into it and be able to buy the cake. But if you have a private business where you just do custom cakes, then I think she would say no. Okay, Beatrice.
Hi, Roger. Everybody. I've been following this group for many months, and so that's perhaps why this essay really, I found it extremely troubling. To my mind, to not legislate against discrimination in education, employment, housing is, I think, to give free rein to discrimination and exclusion, where the dominant group or majority excludes others, minorities, from society's benefits. The distinction between private, social, and public comes back often in Hannah Arendt's writings. It's almost one of the foundational ones. We certainly saw it in Human Condition, which is why I find it important to address this question that has been referred to other speakers. There's an incredible leap for Hannah Arendt from a situation where discrimination seems to be okay in the social realm, but equality is the guiding principle in the public realm. it very much makes me wonder and question the extent to which Arendt's approach, this hard and fast distinction between the social and the public realm, isn't anything more than just an abstract idea with absolutely no practical consequences. And where exactly? Because Roger, you said, well, people can be sensitized or informed of the value of plurality and equality so that they can use those principles in the public realm. Where exactly would that happen? Certainly not in scholarly articles in order to make it work if it's not going to be in education. As you see, I'm troubled by this essay enormously. For that reason, because I find the hard and fast distinction difficult to grasp.
So first of all, let me say there's no hard and fast distinction, right? She makes these distinctions between the three realms. She's perfectly well aware that there's no hard and fast distinction. And in fact, in this essay, she says it. She says, look, I mean, where does education fit? Well, it's partly private, insofar it's the parent's right over the child. It's partly social, insofar it's the child's first foray outside the home and into the public world, but not into a political world, but in the public world, in the social environment. And it's partly political, insofar as this is how in the United States we meet people from different backgrounds and we begin the process of learning about what it means to be a pluralistic American. And so there is no hard and fast distinction, and she's well aware of that. And it's one of the reasons that simply making, this claim and saying, oh, well, there's the public, private, and social realm doesn't decide any questions. It leaves you open for judgment. She's making a judgment, right? And the judgment is one that she makes. We can disagree with her, and I think most of us do. And the judgment in the end is that in the end, education is primarily a private idea, and that to take away people's private right to choose how to raise their children is a violation of their fundamental human rights, and we have to not do that. She would perfectly well understand when someone comes along and says, well, there's also a political right involved, which is the political right of learning to encounter others and strangers and talk to strangers in a pluralistic Republican democracy. She said, you're absolutely right. We need institutions for that. And we may say, we think that political aspect of education is more important than the private loss of the private right. And I'm not sure Arendt 100% disagrees with us, because if you read her essay on the crisis of education, she makes a big deal of this. And she said, in a way, she's saying, I may have gotten this wrong in this essay. But that doesn't mean that she gives up her view that if we do move education from the private to the political, we are abandoning a fundamental private right, and that will have enormous consequences in a country that values such things. And I think that's her point. I know I'd love to let you respond. We got 3 minutes, and I'm going to let Bruce and Shadi come in. Bruce, try and be quick, Bruce and Shadi, so we can get both your questions in.
Yes, thanks very much. I come back to Jana's point and argument. I do think that it's a much better way to understand what's going on, the conceptual framework, if we see them as more interpenetrating and dynamic. In many sentences in this essay, I felt Arendt was writing in a very static and boundary-defined way. At one point, she says the trick is to keep the discrimination and prejudice inside the social realm and not let it leak out into the political. Well, there are many examples already of how it was leaking into the political. And so I just wanted to remind us of the book, The Color of Law, and the idea of redlining and the things that were being done from the New Deal on in the North that were fundamentally detrimental
to the exercise of a Black person's prejudices within the social sphere, but B, fundamentally disabling for the accumulation of wealth over generations and the inequalities we see today. So if Arendt had been more, perhaps more able to articulate the underlying notion of the importance of the interdependence of the various spheres of life in a republic, and to see that the economic inequalities as well as the social prejudices were either conducive to a healthier polis, a healthier political realm, or detrimental to it. I think she would have softened up this idea that the essence of the social is discrimination. The social is also the economic and the cultural, and so it touches our personalities, it touches our wealth, it touches our children's opportunities in the future in profound ways. And of course, we're living through that now in our own time. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, so well taken. But first of all, the book, the color of, which is a good book on redlining, is, Arendt would say, look, if you're discriminating in a bank, in a business district on the basis of race, that's unconstitutional. She would see that as legalized discrimination, which is wrong and unconstitutional, and she would argue against that. So, but I do want to say that I think it's very easy for us today to say, oh, social discrimination is bad. It's become sort of a rote thing. I think Arendt is going to force us, if we take her seriously, and I think she's right on this, to understand that social discrimination is not only unavoidable, it's part of what makes us human. And we have to take it seriously. Shadi, you get the last word.
Yes, I like how my thoughts are very much in line with the last comment and the last question. I read this essay years ago, and I find it quite interesting, actually, because what I found is that in essence, she understood the power of prejudice in the masses of people, comparing to resistance and the power of education people for progressive values or tolerance. That's how I because of my lived experience, and I think that was kind of power of her lived experience as well. She saw how this prejudice can become powerful and create a backlash, because we know from history how Nazis were so afraid of the elite Jewish population in Germany, in Vienna at a time. And I don't want to say history lesson in here, but I think she could see the power of backlash with people with huge prejudice, and she wanted to set the limits of our capability of avoiding that, and just create more progressive environment for the large portion of population like United States. So that was my 2 cents.
Thank you. I think I agree. Yana, do you want a final word? Say anything to sum up?
Oh God. I mean, I fully agree with you, Shadi, if by that you mean that this is about the possibility of inhabiting a common world, right? That is her entire point, and that's why education is so important. And that's why the tension between the realms is more important than the sort of keeping them clean, right? So I don't think this is about, I think this is much larger than these conversations about like, you know, what we can buy and what sort of privileges we have in terms of our identity, or, you know, the example of the bakery. I think the real concern is this idea of responsibility for the world. And how do we have responsibility for the world? Do we have responsibility by the world? Do we show that by trying to abolish racism? Or do we show that by defending a world of difference? Right? That is something that I see here.
Great. Thank you, Jana. Thanks for joining in today. And thank you all. You know, look, these are controversial essays that we're dealing with, and this one is probably the most controversial. So I thank you for the really thoughtful and respectful engagement. For next week, we're reading her essay on violence. I really want to just make sure you, it's a long essay and it's not all about race. There are many parts of it though that are, but the last, it's in 3 parts. And the last part really does engage in race quite a bit, and especially read the footnotes, or what's called the abstract, what's the back, the index, or what is it called when you have anyway, there are notes, and there's a whole section of the book where she has long sort of notes at the back, and those are quite important for what we're going to be discussing. So as you read on violence, focus on that 3rd part and make sure you read all the footnotes and the notes. We'll see you next week at Friday. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt. Thank you very much.